Along the Missouri-Kansas border in the year 1856, certain names were never spoken above a whisper in polite company. Isaiah was one of them. Not Isaiah somebody, not Isaiah with a family name attached, just Isaiah, spoken with the same careful quiet that people used when discussing ghosts or invoking God's name in situations where divine intervention seemed the only possible explanation for events beyond human understanding. The local sheriffs in Jackson County knew him only as a collection of incidents, a pattern of deaths and disappearances that stretched back nearly 12 years. Forming a sequence of violence that seemed too methodical to be random, yet too elusive to be the work of any organization they could identify or infiltrate. The plantation owners who gathered at the Independence Courthouse on the first Monday of each month to discuss county business spoke of him in deliberately vague terms, never quite admitting they feared a man who might not exist at all, whose very existence would suggest vulnerabilities in a system they had spent generations constructing and defending. But the enslaved people who worked the cotton fields and tobacco farms along the Missouri River bottomlands knew exactly who he was. They called him Deliverer when they thought no one could hear, speaking the name in the darkness of their quarters after the overseers had made their final rounds and the main house windows had gone dark. They told stories about him in whispers, passing information through networks that white society never imagined existed, describing incidents and encounters that would never appear in official records. The stories varied in details but agreed on essentials. A black man who moved through the woods like smoke, who carried death for slaveholders and freedom for their captives, who appeared and disappeared without warning, leaving behind burning buildings, dead slave catchers, and empty chains. The boy who would become this legend was born in the late summer of 1831 on a farm 3 miles outside Independence, Missouri, property of a man named Josiah Hendricks. The farm itself was unremarkable by the standards of the region. 68 acres of mediocre soil that produced modest tobacco yields and supported a household of moderate means. Hendricks ran his operation with neither notable cruelty nor particular kindness, existing in that vast middle range of slaveholders who considered themselves decent men, operating within an economic system they had inherited rather than chosen. He kept 14 enslaved people in conditions that were neither remarkably harsh nor notably humane by the standards of the time, which is to say the conditions were brutal by any objective measure, but considered acceptable by the legal and social framework of antebellum Missouri. Isaiah's mother was called Sarah. No one recorded her last name in the plantation records, if she ever had one. The naming conventions for enslaved people varied by owner's whim, and many were simply given single names that served to identify them for work assignments and inventory purposes. She had arrived at the Hendricks farm in 1828, purchased at an estate sale in St. Louis for $350, and had been assigned to work in the main house, cooking and cleaning and performing the domestic tasks that kept the household functioning. The overseer's reports from 1838 to 1841, preserved in the county records along with other plantation documents, noted she was quiet, competent, gives no trouble, which was the highest praise such records typically offered, and which translated to simple competence at assigned tasks without resistance or complaint. In July of 1841, on a Thursday afternoon when the temperature had reached 94 degrees and the air hung heavy with the promise of evening storms, Sarah spilled water on the parlor floor while Mrs. Hendricks was entertaining guests from Kansas City. The women had been discussing the upcoming county fair, and the conversation had been pleasant until the accident disrupted it. The water had been in a crystal pitcher that Sarah was carrying to refill the glasses, and she had stumbled slightly on the edge of a rug, sending perhaps a pint of water spreading across the polished wooden floor near where Mrs. Hendricks sat with her guests. It was an accident, nothing more. The kind of minor domestic mishap that might occur in any household on any day. But it had occurred in front of guests, which made it a matter of household discipline and public face rather than private error. Mrs. Hendricks stood immediately, her face tight with the kind of embarrassment that comes not from genuine distress, but from having one's household management judged inadequate by social equals. She ordered Sarah to the yard, her voice controlled but carrying an edge that everyone in the room recognized. The guests fell silent, understanding what would follow, and offering no objection, because to object would be to suggest their hostess was managing her property improperly, which would create its own social complications. 20 lashes was the sentence, delivered by Caleb Rourke, the farm's overseer, while the other servants watched from the kitchen door. This public witnessing was standard practice. Punishment was meant to serve as deterrent, not just for the individual being disciplined, but for everyone who might consider similar failures in the future. Isaiah was 10 years old, standing among the other children near the chicken coop, and he counted each strike with the kind of terrible precision that traumatized children often develop, creating order from chaos through the simple act of enumeration. 1, 2, 3. Each number burned into his memory with the sound of leather striking flesh, a sound that was worse than he'd expected, though he'd heard it before from a distance. What made this different was the proximity and the identity of the victim, and the slow understanding that no one was going to intervene. That this was simply how the world worked. That his mother was being beaten to death in front of him, and the only response from the universe was the continued counting of numbers. Sarah never cried out. Years later, when Isaiah thought about that afternoon, and he would think about it often, it being the kind of memory that shapes everything that follows, he would remember this detail most clearly. She had remained silent throughout, accepting the punishment without protest, maintaining the kind of dignity that cost everything, and accomplished nothing but which was perhaps the only form of resistance available to her in that moment. The watching servants understood this better than the white people present ever would. They saw a woman refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of hearing her pain, even as that refusal cost her the last reserves of strength that might have kept her alive. Sarah died that evening, sometime between sunset and full dark. The overseer's report, filed with the county clerk 2 days later, as required by law for the death of any property valued over $200, listed the cause as heart failure following discipline, which satisfied the legal requirements and raised no questions from authorities. The phrase was deliberately vague, avoiding any suggestion of excessive punishment while acknowledging that discipline had occurred. It was a formula that appeared regularly in such records, a linguistic compromise that acknowledged death while avoiding assignment of fault or liability. Josiah Hendricks paid $3 for burial costs. The amount covered a simple pine coffin and the labor of 2 field hands to dig the grave, and deducted the expense from his quarterly accounts. The loss of Sarah's value, estimated at $350 based on her age and skills, was claimed against his annual property losses for tax purposes. Something fundamental broke in the boy that day, though it took 3 years for anyone to notice the full extent of the damage. Isaiah continued working in the fields, kept his head down, caused no problems that would appear in the overseer's reports or draw attention from the Hendricks family. He learned to move quietly through the farm, to observe without appearing to watch, to understand the patterns and rhythms of the operation without drawing attention to his understanding. The overseer, Caleb Rourke, occasionally commented that the boy was unnaturally quiet, but quiet slaves were easier to manage than loud ones, and Rourke had more pressing concerns than wondering about the interior thoughts of a 10-year-old field hand. What Rourke and the others didn't know was that Isaiah spent those 3 years preparing. He watched which directions the search parties traveled when slaves escaped. He learned which areas of the surrounding forest they avoided and why. The thick undergrowth that horses couldn't penetrate, the creek beds that would hide tracks, the hollow trees and dense thickets that could conceal a human body. He observed the patterns of the farm's daily operations with the kind of attention that children bring to subjects they're genuinely interested in, noting which gates were locked and when, where the dogs were kept, which roads the slave catchers used when they brought back runaways. He was building a map in his mind, not of the farm itself, but of the spaces beyond it, the wilderness that white society viewed as empty, but which actually contained possibilities for someone who knew how to look. He also watched Caleb Rourke. He studied the overseer's movements with particular attention, learning his routines and habits, observing which paths he took when traveling to town, noting that he rode alone and usually returned after dark when he'd been drinking at the tavern in Independence. Isaiah didn't think of this as planning for revenge. He was too young to conceptualize it in those terms. But he was learning the patterns, storing information that would become useful later, building a detailed understanding of the man who had killed his mother. In August of 1844, 3 years and 1 month after Sarah's death, Isaiah disappeared from the Hendricks farm. Rourke organized a search party the next morning, following standard procedures for runaway slaves: dogs, armed men, systematic checking of likely hiding spots within a 5-mile radius of the farm. They found nothing. No tracks leading north toward free territory. No signs of struggle suggesting he'd been taken by animals. No evidence that anyone had helped the boy escape. The dogs lost his scent at the creek that formed the southern boundary of the Hendricks property, and despite 2 more days of searching, no trace of Isaiah could be found. After 3 days, Rourke called off the search and reported the loss to Josiah Hendricks. The boy's value was estimated at $400, lower than a fully grown field hand, but reflecting his youth and the investment required to raise him to working age. Hendricks filed the loss with his insurance company and claimed it against his annual property losses. Everyone assumed the boy had died in the woods, taken by exposure or animals or some combination of misfortune that regularly claimed runaways who lacked preparation or assistance. The incident was recorded in the county ledgers and forgotten by everyone except the other enslaved people on the Hendricks farm, who wondered but said nothing, understanding that speculation about successful escapes was dangerous. They were wrong about the death. Isaiah was 13 years old and very much alive, living in the dense forest that stretched along the Missouri River bottomlands, about 7 miles south of the Hendricks farm. He'd spent 3 years preparing for his escape, and unlike most runaways who fled north toward freedom, he had run in a different direction entirely. He had gone into the wilderness, into the thick growth where white men rarely traveled, and where someone who moved carefully could disappear completely. He had taken nothing with him except the clothes he wore and a knife he'd stolen from the farm's tool shed 3 months earlier, hiding it in a hollow tree and checking periodically to make sure it remained undiscovered. On the night he left, he'd waited until well after midnight, until even the dogs had settled into sleep and the overseer's rounds had finished. He'd climbed out the window of the quarters, not through the door, which was locked and would creak, and moved through the shadows of the outbuildings toward the creek. He'd walked in the water for nearly 3 miles, leaving no scent for dogs to follow, before climbing out on the far side and disappearing into the forest. The first week was the hardest. He had no food except what he could forage: berries, roots, plants he remembered his mother pointing out as edible. He was hungry constantly, cold at night despite the summer heat, terrified of every sound in the darkness. But he survived. He learned to set snares for rabbits using techniques he'd watched trappers demonstrate. He found caves and hollow trees that provided shelter. He located springs and streams that provided water. He moved deeper into the wilderness each day, putting distance between himself and the farm, learning the landscape with the kind of intimate attention that comes from necessity. By the end of the first month, he had established a routine. He had a shelter, a dense thicket of undergrowth that formed a natural concealment, invisible from more than 10 feet away. He had reliable food sources. He knew which berries were safe and which would make him sick. He could catch fish using a trap made from woven sticks. He could move through the forest almost silently, stepping carefully to avoid breaking branches, learning to read the woods the way other people read books. But survival wasn't his goal. Isaiah hadn't run into the wilderness to live in hiding. He had run there to prepare, to build strength, to wait for the right moment. Because 3 years of watching Caleb Rourke had taught him something important. The overseer was predictable. He traveled to Independence twice a month, always on the same road, always returning after dark. And Isaiah intended to be waiting. It took 3 more months before the opportunity came. In November of 1844, on a cold night when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the road through the forest was darker than usual, Caleb Rourke rode home from Independence, slightly drunk and completely unaware that he was being followed. Isaiah had been tracking him since sunset, moving through the trees parallel to the road, keeping pace with the horse, waiting for the right spot. When Rourke stopped to relieve himself near a stand of oak trees, the same spot he always stopped, being a man of fixed habits, Isaiah emerged from the darkness with the knife and cut the overseer's throat so quickly that Rourke never had time to reach for the pistol on his belt. The whole thing took perhaps 5 seconds. Rourke collapsed without a sound, blood spreading across the fallen leaves, and Isaiah stood over him feeling nothing at all. No satisfaction, no remorse, no sense of justice accomplished. Just a cold emptiness that would remain with him for the rest of his life. He took Rourke's pistol, a flintlock that felt heavy in his hand, and a powder horn containing enough for perhaps 20 shots. He took the hat Rourke had been wearing, a wide-brimmed thing that would help conceal his face. And then he walked back into the forest and disappeared. The authorities found Rourke 6 days later. A merchant traveling the Independence Road had noticed vultures circling and investigated, finding the body badly decomposed but clearly murdered. The throat wound was too clean and precise to be anything but intentional killing. The county sheriff, a man named William Bradshaw, organized an investigation. He interviewed the Hendricks household, checked for recently escaped slaves, questioned people who had been at the tavern the night Rourke died. He found nothing useful. No witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive beyond the general violence that occasionally erupted along the Missouri-Kansas border in those years before the Civil War. The case remained unsolved, filed away with other frontier violence, and life continued. Josiah Hendricks hired a new overseer. The enslaved people on the farm whispered among themselves about Rourke's death, some suggesting divine justice, others warning against such talk. And in the forest, Isaiah taught himself to shoot. He practiced with Rourke's pistol, firing at trees until he could hit targets reliably at 20 paces. He learned to maintain the weapon, to keep it clean and functional. He stole powder and shot from an isolated cabin he'd been watching, waiting until the trapper who lived there had left for town before breaking in and taking what he needed. He was 14 years old and becoming something that had no name in the conventional sense. Not quite a runaway, not quite a rebel, but something in between. A person who had left the world of plantations and slavery but hadn't entered any other world, existing instead in the spaces between, in the forests and back roads where authority didn't quite reach. That was 1844. Over the next 12 years, Isaiah would be connected to more than 50 confirmed deaths, though the actual number was likely higher. Some incidents were never reported, some bodies never found, some deaths attributed to accident or misfortune rather than murder. He developed a method that was both brutally simple and devastatingly effective. He would spend weeks, sometimes months, observing a plantation. He would learn who came and went, understand the relationships between owners and overseers, identify the slave catchers who frequented the area, map the daily routines that governed operations. Then he would act, sometimes setting fire to barns or cotton stores in the dead of night, choosing moments when wind would spread flames quickly and when water sources were distant. Sometimes he would ambush isolated riders on remote roads, choosing locations where bodies wouldn't be found quickly and where tracks would be difficult to follow. Sometimes he would simply appear in the slave quarters late at night, leading groups of people into the wilderness before vanishing again before dawn. In 1847, a plantation owner named Marcus Whitfield died when his barn burned with him inside it. Witnesses later reported seeing a tall black man near the property that evening. Though no one could provide useful details, the description could have matched hundreds of men in the region. The fire destroyed $2,800 worth of stored cotton, a devastating loss that represented an entire season's production, and killed 3 horses valued at $600 total, in addition to Whitfield himself. His widow, Rebecca Whitfield, tried to maintain the plantation for 6 months before accepting that she lacked the capital and knowledge to continue. She sold the property at a loss and moved to St. Louis, where her family provided support. The land was eventually purchased by speculators and divided into smaller parcels. The investigation into Whitfield's death concluded that the fire had been deliberately set. The burn patterns and multiple points of origin made that clear. But authorities couldn't establish who had set it or why. Some suspected disgruntled slaves, others thought it might be related to Whitfield's business dealings, which had apparently involved some questionable loans and disputed contracts. The case remained officially unsolved, though Sheriff Bradshaw noted in his personal records that this incident bore similarities to other plantation fires in the region, suggesting a possible pattern. In 1849, 2 federal marshals named Gibson and Terrell were found dead on the road between Independence and Kansas City. Both had been shot once in the head from close range, execution-style killings that suggested professional work rather than random violence. Their horses were left grazing nearby, saddlebags intact except for one significant absence. They'd been carrying arrest warrants for 7 fugitive slaves, and those documents were missing. Everything else was untouched: their money, weapons, personal effects. The killer had taken only the warrants. The federal government took this case seriously. Killing federal marshals was a capital offense that demanded response, and the Attorney General's office sent investigators from Washington to assist local authorities. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, checked every known abolitionist and Free State sympathizer in the region, pursued leads that went nowhere. The investigation continued for 8 months before being quietly shelved, the official conclusion noting that the perpetrators could not be identified from available evidence, though the incident appears related to organized resistance to federal fugitive slave enforcement. What the investigators never knew was that Isaiah had followed Gibson and Terrell for 3 days, learning their route and habits before setting up the ambush. He'd chosen a spot where the road curved through thick trees, where he could approach from concealment and where the sound of shots would be muffled. He'd killed both men in less than 10 seconds, 2 shots, both fatal, before either marshal could draw his weapon. Then he'd taken the warrants, memorized the names and descriptions, and disappeared into the forest to begin planning how to locate those 7 people before other slave catchers found them. In 1851, Isaiah accomplished something that became legendary in the clandestine networks of enslaved people throughout the region. He led 18 people off the Morrison plantation in Jackson County in a single night. Not a small group that could move quickly and quietly, but 18 individuals including children and an elderly woman who could barely walk. The logistics were extraordinary. He'd spent 2 months preparing, identifying sympathetic free blacks who could provide temporary shelter, locating caves and hidden valleys that could conceal large groups, stockpiling food and supplies in caches along the route he'd planned. On the chosen night, he'd entered the plantation at midnight, moving through the quarters and waking specific people whose names he'd learned through careful intelligence gathering. He'd told them to take nothing, make no noise, follow his instructions exactly. They'd moved in a line through the darkness, following paths Isaiah had scouted extensively, stopping frequently to rest and regroup. When dogs came after them the next morning, Isaiah had them split into smaller groups, each taking different routes with instructions to reunite at designated points. Some groups waded through creeks to break the scent trail. Others circled back before heading north, creating confusion about their direction. All 18 people disappeared so completely that not one was ever recovered. Morrison posted a $500 reward, an enormous sum that reflected both his fury and his desperation, but no one came forward with information. The incident was discussed in hushed tones throughout the region for months afterward. How could 18 people vanish without leaving a trace? The prevailing theory was that they'd had assistance from organized abolitionist networks, possibly connected to the underground railroad operations that everyone knew existed, but no one could prove. The truth that a single man had orchestrated and executed the entire operation never occurred to most investigators. By 1853, the pattern was clear enough that authorities began to suspect a single individual might be responsible for multiple incidents. The Jackson County Sheriff, William Bradshaw, was a methodical man who kept detailed records. He collected reports spanning 9 years and began noting similarities. The plantation fires all occurred on moonless nights when wind conditions would spread flames quickly. The ambushes all took place on remote roads at locations that suggested advanced scouting. The missing slaves all disappeared in groups that were large enough to be significant, but small enough to move quickly if properly organized. Bradshaw drafted a confidential report for the county commissioners, in which he concluded that a Negro man, possibly in his 20s, operating alone or with minimal assistance, has been conducting systematic attacks against property owners and law enforcement along the border. The description was necessarily vague. Witness accounts were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some witnesses claimed the man was tall, others said average height. Some said he was light-skinned, others dark. The only consistent details were that he moved silently, appeared and disappeared without warning, and left no survivors who could provide clear identification. The report was marked confidential because Bradshaw understood the political implications. Admitting that a single black man had been operating successfully against white authority for nearly a decade would suggest weaknesses in the system that plantation owners preferred not to acknowledge. It would raise questions about security, competence, and the fundamental assumptions underlying slave society. Better to handle the situation quietly, increase patrols, warn plantation owners to improve their security, and hope the problem resolved itself. The newspapers handled the story with similar care. The Independence Examiner referred to disturbances along the border region, without providing specifics that might alarm readers or provide too much information to potential sympathizers. The Kansas City Enterprise mentioned a dangerous fugitive operating in the area, but avoided inflammatory language that might inspire others. The careful vagueness served everyone's interests except those who wanted the truth. But the plantation owners, meeting privately at the Independence Courthouse on the first Monday of each month, discussed the situation in practical terms, stripped of euphemism. Several hired additional guards, men with military experience who understood security rather than just slave management. Some installed better locks on their buildings and started keeping dogs inside secure compounds. A few quietly armed their overseers with rifles instead of the usual whips, acknowledging that the threat they faced came not from unarmed, unorganized slaves, but from someone who possessed both weapons and expertise. The bounty on Isaiah's head increased steadily. It started at $100 in 1847, rose to $500 after the Morrison incident in 1851, and reached $1,000 by 1854. By 1856, it stood at $2,000, an enormous sum that represented 2 years' wages for a skilled craftsman or the price of a prime field hand. The amount reflected both the scale of damage Isaiah had caused and the frustration of authorities who couldn't capture him despite devoting substantial resources to the effort. But Isaiah was never captured. He killed with precision that suggested not rage, but methodology. Choosing targets carefully, planning approaches thoroughly, executing without hesitation. He never killed randomly, never acted impulsively. Every action served a purpose, whether eliminating specific threats or creating terror among slave catchers and plantation owners. He studied situations for weeks before acting, learning patterns and vulnerabilities, identifying moments when security would be weakest. The enslaved people throughout the region followed his activities through the informal networks that white society never fully understood. Information traveled from plantation to plantation, carried by hired-out workers, passed along at markets, whispered in churches where black congregations met under white supervision. They knew which fires were accidents and which bore Isaiah's signature. They recognized his work in certain disappearances and knew which routes to avoid, because Isaiah might be using them. Some thought of him as a hero, others as a dangerous madness that would bring retribution on all black people in the region. But everyone knew his name. In 1856, Isaiah was 25 years old. The sheriffs in 3 counties had connected him to at least 40 documented deaths over the previous decade, including 12 plantation owners, 15 slave catchers, 6 overseers, and 2 federal marshals. This count included only incidents where evidence pointed clearly to murder rather than accident. The actual number was certainly higher. The pattern was so clear that the Missouri legislature discussed the case in closed session in February 1856, though no record of their conclusions was ever published. Various proposals were considered: increased military patrols along the border, rewards for information leading to capture, legislation making it easier to prosecute accomplices. Nothing was implemented, partly because of cost and partly because legislators couldn't agree on whether the threat was truly significant or being exaggerated by plantation owners seeking government assistance for private security. The bounty of $2,000 represented the highest price ever placed on a fugitive slave in Missouri history. For comparison, the reward for train robbers and murderers rarely exceeded $500. The enormous sum reflected recognition that Isaiah represented something unprecedented, not just a runaway or a criminal, but an enemy combatant conducting organized warfare against the institution of slavery itself. Then, sometime in late 1856 or early 1857, Isaiah disappeared completely from the historical record. The last confirmed incident attributed to him occurred on November 18, 1856, when a cotton warehouse in Kansas City burned to the ground. The fire started around midnight and spread rapidly through the building, which contained approximately 400 bales of cotton awaiting shipment downriver to St. Louis. The total loss was estimated at $4,200, the cotton itself worth roughly $3,800, with the rest representing building damage and equipment. 3 witnesses reported seeing a black man in the vicinity shortly before the fire started, though as usual the descriptions were too vague to be useful. After November 1856, nothing. No more fires, no more ambushes, no more disappearances that bore Isaiah's characteristic signatures. The incidents simply stopped, as completely and mysteriously as they had begun. Sheriff Bradshaw noted in his journal that the Negro Isaiah has either died, departed the region, or concluded his campaign for reasons unknown. The bounty remained posted for another 5 years, until the outbreak of the Civil War made such matters irrelevant as the entire social structure of slavery began its collapse. The absence of conclusion frustrated everyone who had followed the case. Some people claimed Isaiah had died in the woods, finally succumbing to illness or injury after years of living rough. The theory had merit. His lifestyle would have been brutally hard, with limited medical care and constant stress. Others insisted he'd escaped to Canada or California, choosing freedom over continued warfare. A few suggested he'd been killed quietly by plantation owners who wanted to avoid the publicity of a trial and simply disposed of the body in ways that left no trace. But the enslaved people along the Missouri-Kansas border told different stories. They said Isaiah never left, that he was still out there watching the roads at night, that he'd simply become even more careful and selective about his actions. They reported incidents that never made it into official records. A slave catcher found dead in circumstances that couldn't be explained. A fire at an isolated farm that seemed too targeted to be accidental. Strangers who appeared in quarters at night with information about routes north. These stories were impossible to verify but persistent enough to suggest some basis in reality. For decades after the Civil War ended, people in western Missouri would occasionally report seeing an old black man watching from tree lines or walking lonely roads after dark. The descriptions were always vague. Tall or average height, light or dark skin, young or old, depending on who was telling the story. But the watchers always shared certain characteristics. They moved silently, disappeared when approached, and carried themselves with a bearing that suggested they feared no one. The authorities never officially closed the case. For decades, the file remained open in the Jackson County Courthouse, gathering dust alongside other unsolved mysteries from the border conflicts that preceded the Civil War. The documents included witness statements, sheriff's reports, reward notices, and various theories about the fugitive's identity and whereabouts. Researchers who examined these materials in later years noted the unusual thoroughness of the investigation, thousands of man-hours devoted to capturing a single individual, and the equally unusual absence of resolution. One historian, writing in 1923 as part of a broader study of pre-war violence in Missouri, observed that the Isaiah case represents either remarkable incompetence by multiple law enforcement agencies operating over a prolonged period, or remarkable skill by a single individual operating alone against overwhelming odds. Given the general competence demonstrated by these same agencies in other matters, the latter explanation seems more probable, which raises disturbing questions about the true capabilities of the enslaved population and the vulnerability of the institution that held them in bondage. No grave has ever been found. No death certificate was ever filed in any Missouri or Kansas county. Isaiah exists only in whispers and carefully documented incidents that stopped as mysteriously as they began, and in the stories that old people still tell in certain parts of Missouri and Kansas. The stories vary in details, but agree on essentials. A man who waged his own private war and disappeared without ever surrendering, who killed more than 50 people in pursuit of a revenge that could never be complete, and who might still be out there watching, waiting, remembering. The Missouri State Archives hold 3 boxes of documents related to the case, preserved as part of the broader collection of pre-war border conflict materials. The bounty notices, printed on cheap paper that has yellowed with age. The sheriff's reports, written in careful script that suggests the importance attached to the investigation. The witness statements that describe a ghost more than a man. And in one folder, wrapped in fading ribbon and marked Evidence November 1856, a single piece of paper found at the site of the Kansas City warehouse fire. The paper was high-quality writing stock, the kind that would have been expensive and unusual for someone of Isaiah's background to possess. The writing on it was in careful script, suggesting education and practice. It contained just 4 words: remember, justice never forgets. The handwriting was never matched to any known sample. The paper was traced to a St. Louis printer, but proved to have been sold through multiple retailers, making it impossible to determine who purchased that particular sheet. The message itself was analyzed by various authorities, who concluded it was probably meant as a warning or testament, though to whom and for what purpose remained unclear. That piece of paper, preserved in the Missouri State Archives, remains the only direct communication ever attributed to Isaiah. 4 words that might mean everything or nothing, written in elegant script by a man who had been born into slavery and who spent more than a decade killing the people who maintained that system. Whether he wrote it as a promise or a warning, whether he intended it for his enemies or his allies, whether he believed justice had been achieved or merely postponed, no one knows. What is known is this. From 1844 to 1856, a man who called himself Isaiah waged a private war along the Missouri-Kansas border, killing more than 50 people in pursuit of a revenge that began with 20 lashes delivered on a July afternoon when he was 10 years old. He was never captured, never tried, never punished by the legal system that had failed to protect his mother or acknowledge her murder. He simply disappeared, leaving behind burned buildings, dead slave catchers, empty chains, and a legacy that no one quite knew how to categorize or explain. The full truth probably died with him, whenever and wherever that occurred. But the stories persist, passed down through generations, changing in details but maintaining their essential character. Stories about a man who refused to accept his assigned place in the world, who transformed grief into methodology and rage into precision, and who demonstrated that the system of slavery could be challenged not just through organized rebellion, but through individual determination sustained over years. Whether Isaiah died in 1856 or lived to see the end of slavery in 1865, whether he found peace or carried his rage to the grave, whether he considered his war won or merely suspended, remains unknown. What is certain is that for 12 years, the plantation owners and slave catchers of western Missouri lived in fear of a man they could never catch, and the enslaved people of the region had hope because one person had proven that resistance was possible. The last documented reference to Isaiah appears in a letter written in 1889 by a formerly enslaved woman named Clara Washington, who had lived on a plantation in Jackson County during the 1850s. She was responding to a researcher collecting oral histories about the pre-war period. In her letter, written in shaky script that suggested advanced age, she described hearing stories about Isaiah from other enslaved people. We knew about him, though we never saw him. The overseers told us he was a demon, that he would kill us all if we didn't stay in line. But we knew different. We knew he was a man who had lost everything and decided that if he couldn't have justice, he would have vengeance. We knew he was out there in the woods, watching and waiting, and it gave us hope. Not hope that we would be free. Most of us knew we would die in bondage, but hope that someone was fighting back, that we weren't all just accepting what was done to us. That mattered more than you might think. That testimony, preserved in the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, represents perhaps the truest assessment of Isaiah's legacy. He didn't free thousands of people or spark a general uprising. He didn't change laws or shift political sentiment, but he fought back in the only way available to him, with the only weapons he possessed, for as long as he could. And in doing so, he became something that the system of slavery could not easily categorize or dismiss. Not property, not criminal, not rebel, but something in between. An individual who refused his assigned role and created his own, who waged war on his own terms and on his own schedule, and who disappeared into history, leaving only questions and contradictions behind. In the end, Isaiah remains what he was in life: a whisper, a pattern, a possibility. The man who might have been, who probably was, who certainly existed in some form even if the details remain forever uncertain. The Avenger of Kansas City, who took 20 lashes delivered on a July afternoon and transformed them into a decade of vengeance that no one could stop and no one could explain. The files remain open in the archives. The bounty notices fade in their folders. The stories continue to be told. And somewhere in the forests along the Missouri-Kansas border, in the places where history bleeds into legend, people still claim to hear footsteps in the darkness when no one is there.
I'm freezing. I'm bleeding. slowly fading away. But don't worry, I'm fine. The cold has settled in my heartbeat, like winter living in my veins. Every breath feels numb and fragile, every smile just hides the pain. I'm breaking quietly in silence, falling slow without a sound. Yet I keep saying I'm okay, while my world burns to the ground. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. Maybe pain just learned to live here, maybe sorrow feels like home. So I wear my wounds like armor and survive them all alone. I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. If you ever see me smiling, no, it's just my last defense. 'Cause sometimes love means hiding how much you're suffering. No, I'm frozen here, I'm bleeding slowly, dying piece by piece inside. But I still whisper, it's alright, just to keep you from goodbye. I'm shattered, love, but don't you worry, I'll pretend till my last breath. Even while my soul is fading, I'll say everything's okay. It's okay. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger, now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you. I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again.